For 3D Part 2, you're asked to draw a flowchart. Now, I can't show you the full flowchart because the sort of thing that goes on is very similar in any system where there is a form being filled in. And that is what you're going to have to do in the real coursework. So I'm going to give you a few clues though as to how to go about producing the flowchart and some of the things that you will need to think about. First of all, you can, if you want to, just use a terminator symbol and a process symbol. In fact, you can just use a process symbol and do everything through this rectangle. But you might find it useful to use different symbols. Now, these symbols are taken from Microsoft Visio. You may have another standard. It doesn't matter what standard you use. You'll be marked on what is present in that flowchart and whether or not it makes sense. So, first of all, you need to make sure that you have a start and an end. Okay, your terminators. Once you've started, there will be an arrow that goes to the first process. It is important that the arrowhead is shown so that we can see the direction that the process is taking. Now, if you think about what's taking place, the question asks for what happens after the submit button is pressed. So it could be that the start is the pressing of a submit button, but to be safe, I think it's a good idea to put user click submit as a process or something along those lines just here. Then we're going to have something that takes place after the user has clicked submit. At this point, some decisions are going to be made as to whether the validation has worked or not. So there's going to be some sort of validation check that takes place. Now, I deliberately haven't put in here what that validation check will actually be. It does need to be specific though. You can't just write the word validation check. There needs to be a question. So you need to put that in. Let's say it was a number. Right? So we could say, is the number greater than 5? You'd then have a yes route and a no route. Now, the no route, we would expect to come up with an error message. Again, we can just type error message, or we can be specific about which error message we want to appear. After that error message has appeared, something else should happen. Something else is going to take place before the user clicks submit again. So you need to think about what might happen once the error message has appeared. Before the user clicks submit and we go through this whole thing again, what will the user do? Now, if we go down and continue throughout, we need to have a look at the next validation rule. So you will need another validation rule in there if you've got 2 in there, because it does ask for 2. And we also then need to think about what outputs are going to be taking place. Well, if you read the question that was asked, it will tell you about confirmation screens, confirmation emails, and sending an email to the royal return. So you need to think about those different outputs and how you're going to put those outputs into place. They'll need to have some sort of process, and they'll need to have an arrow going to that output. So here's the output, but there's no process for that output. The next thing and the final thing before we look at the overall flowchart is that it will need to go to the end. So your flowchart will need to have a finish. So you just need to think about what's taking place at each stage. To make things a little bit more complicated, in the real coursework you're asked to show client-server technology and how that works. Therefore, in a similar but different tasks, I've asked you to identify on each of these processes and questions or decisions whether it is taking place at the client side or whether it is taking place at the server side. So if we think about a user clicking submit, the user's doing it at their local computer, so you should be able to identify whether that is a client or whether it's a server. An error message that appears on the computer screen. Again, you should be able to identify whether that's taking place locally at the client or centrally at a server. The validation check is a little bit more tricky though, because it depends on how you've set it up. If you've used HTML5, it's all happening locally. The same with JavaScript. But there are other methods of doing validation which will take place at the server side. Depending on what software you're using, you need to get advice from your teacher as to whether the validation is taking place locally or whether it is taking place on a server. If it takes place on a server, all the validation will take place at once. Whereas if it's taking place locally, it will usually be one at a time. But it's not a golden rule. It could work both ways. Check with your teacher and ask them if they can give you some advice on that. So identify something like server or client on each of these as to where it's taking place. The data at some point has to get passed from the client, from the web browser, to the server where all the effort takes place for sending emails and so on. And those processes that are taking place on the server, you need to have identified those within your flowchart as well. I hope this has given you enough to get started. As I say, I can't really give you much more information than this because otherwise I'm giving away what the solution is to this type of task.